My honor and pleasure to serve as the Assistant to the President and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Northern Iowa. I will be your moderator today. So I get to introduce our wonderful speakers, Chantilla Caston and Melissa Payne. The only fair way to do that is to do this alphabetically. So we'll start with Chantilla, with last name, just like we learned in first grade. Chantilla Caston is a licensed independent social worker who is a mental health therapist on campus at UNI. In addition to her duties as a therapist, she is tasked with conducting diversity outreach for mental health. She earned her undergraduate and master's degrees in social work, specializing in trauma-informed practice from the University of Northern Iowa. Chantilla has an extensive history in providing culturally competent and trauma-focused mental health services to diverse individuals, couples, and groups. Her clinical areas of focus include depression, anxiety, relationship issues, sexuality issues, trauma, grief, women's issues, issues related to identity, race, gender, and overall life transitions. Thank you for being with us, Chantilla.
Thank you.
Melissa Payne has been the Dean of Students at Kirkwood Community College for 5 years. In this role, Melissa works to engage students, faculty, and staff while developing a positive environment for learning and growth. She oversees a variety of functional areas, including academic advising, counseling, career services, orientation, student assistance and outreach, and student conduct. The Dean of Students office at Kirkwood focuses on relationship building, resources, and student success. Melissa has worked in a variety of roles, including full-time faculty, advisor, case manager, and administrator at 2- and 4-year institutions in Iowa. Melissa views higher education as the ideal place to help others unlock their potential as allies for social justice. Regardless of her job title, the work of creating space for a diverse set of perspectives and cultivating people to be ready to hear the voices of others, I'm sorry, I didn't drag this down, has characterized her work. Welcome, Melissa. Thank you for being with us. I will now turn it over to the two experts.
All right. Well, thank you, Gwen, for that introduction. Hello, everybody. We are excited to be here today and to be able to facilitate some conversation and discussion around this topic. So the title of our session, like we said, is Racial Trauma and How It Impacts All of Us. So I first want to start off with a trigger warning. Obviously, we are talking about a topic that can be uncomfortable. It can provoke emotions, intense emotions. So if you feel like you need to take care of yourself, please do so by maybe stepping away from the computer screen or muting it. So next, I want to kind of give just an overview of what trauma is. It can be defined so many different ways, but for the sake of today's discussion, I want to give kind of a brief overview of what trauma is when we're talking about it. So trauma can be any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, and any other disruptive feelings that are intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on one's personality, their attitude, their behaviors, and possibly other aspects of their functioning. A traumatic event can include and can be caused by a behavior from a human or by nature. So human behavior is obviously something like being mugged on the side of the street. That would be like a human behavior. And nature would be something like being a part of a hurricane or a tornado when we think about the Midwest. Also, in regards to that, someone's view or perspective of the world around them, typically it's like adjusted when they go through situations like this, because we interpret the situation that we've been through, and then that creates a different lens of how we view the world, especially in regards to it being just, safe, or predictable. So that's kind of like a overview or a definition of trauma and kind of like what a trauma event could be like. So next, I know everybody loves this part of like the presentations and like conversations is an activity. But this activity is going to be a visualization one, so it won't require you to interact with anybody else, actually, speak or say very much at all. The purpose of a visualization activity is it's important when it comes to building empathy. It helps you, have an understanding about other people's experiences. It builds like that human connection with one another. And then also, it's really helpful for perspective taking, right? And that's having the ability to take another person's perspective or to recognize another person's perspective as their truth. So, I want you guys to go ahead and get comfortable in your seat. If you feel comfortable, I like for you to close your eyes, or you're welcome to find a point of focus. So just like an object that you could kind of focus on. Go ahead and take a deep breath in and out for me. Like I said, relax. I would like for you to visualize that you have an easily identifiable physical characteristic about yourself that can't be altered, it can't be adjusted, it can't be hidden or removed. Next, I would like for you to imagine that you live in a community in which other groups are in this community who also share physical identifiable characteristics about themselves. Next, I would like for you to imagine that you have experienced what is a traumatic event in which you believed or you knew it was based solely on this physical characteristic that you have and that as well as you share within your group, keeping in mind what a traumatic event is. And while you're doing this, I like for you to pay attention to any of the thoughts or feelings or sensations that might be coming up for you. Next, I like for you to imagine that you have also witnessed others who belong to your group that you share the same physical characteristics with be injured, be shamed, be mistreated, or they have lost their lives. And you know and you're aware that this was solely based upon their physical characteristics. The physical characteristic that you also share, as well as this characteristic, can't be altered or adjusted. Next, I would like for you to imagine knowing that these incidents happen, they happen often, and you know you have no control over whether these events happen or not, because they're basically based upon your physical characteristics in which you have and were born with. Lastly, I like for you to imagine that your experiences, your feelings, or your thoughts in regards to these incidents are often invalidated by others in which the environment that you live in. All right, and that would be it for the visualization activity. You can open your eyes or stop staring at your point of focus. And real quick and briefly, I like for you to jot down some of your feelings or your thoughts or any sensations that came up for you during that time, either by writing it on a paper if you have it in front of you, or I would love it if you could write it in the chat, and then we'll kind of come back around to that later. In 2000, the US Surgeon General stated that racial and ethnic health disparities were likely due to racism. I'd like you to take a look at some of these images that we have on the screen here. A lot of these are recent. The current presence of racial discrimination and recent rise in hate crimes, oppressive immigration laws and policies, and police brutality highlights the importance of discussing the consequences of racial trauma and discrimination. In regards to racial trauma, there is a lot of different aspects that can contribute to racial trauma. But for today's discussion, I'm going to focus on historical trauma, race-based stress, and intersectionality. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about historical trauma. I'm not going to go too in-depth into it. I just want to give an overview. But the term historical trauma was coined by Dr. Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart in the 1980s. She saw a lot of people in her community going through a lot of intense emotions, using maybe negative coping skills based on some of the traumatic experiences that their ancestors had been through, as well as them. And she wanted to give a name to it. So she defined it as a cumulative, emotional, physical, and psychological harm of individuals and groups and generations that have been caused by traumatic events and experiences. So naturally, when we think about some of those traumatic events, we think about the enslavement of Africans in many countries, including the US. We kind of think about the descendants of Holocaust survivors. Um, when we think about Indigenous persons, we think about how they had a history of being placed in boarding schools. A lot of them were massacred, and a lot of them were violently removed from their lands. Historical trauma basically can cause a suffering that can be transmitted from generation to generation, and it definitely can have a long-lasting impact on a person's mental health as well as their well-being. So as we start to talk a little bit about race-based stress, that was the purpose of my visualization activity. I was hoping to give you a small perspective of what it could be like to experience race-based stress. I'm gonna go to the chats just to see if anybody shared any of their experiences in regards to that. It looks like one person said, I felt myself retreat inward. Very powerful exercise. I have thought the first piece, but adding the community aligns with it really hit differently. Still processing. Dismissal. I felt rage and flashbacks to news clips of race-based crime these past years. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Thank you guys for sharing. So I want to go ahead and just define what race-based stress is, and that refers to people of color or indigenous persons' reactions to dangerous events and real or perceived racial discrimination. These racial discrimination events could be threats of harm, injury, death, humiliating and shameful events, and just witnessing racial discrimination toward others that belong in the group in which we identify with. So these are going to be like the images that we see on the news. They're going to be the videos of the Karens or the Kens. They're going to be the videos of police brutality. Nowadays, the internet and social media has just made it so easy for us to witness people be shamed or to be injured based on their race. Following COVID-19 outbreak in the US, there were nearly 1,500 reported incidents of anti-Asian racism in just 1 month alone. Reports included incidents of physical and verbal attacks, as well as reports of anti-Asian discrimination in private businesses. In 2018, 38% of Latinx people were verbally attacked for speaking Spanish, were told to go back to their countries, called racial slurs, and were treated unfairly by others. Over the course of 1 year, Twitter saw 4.2 million anti-Semitic tweets in just the English language alone. These tweets included anti-Semitic stereotypes, promotion of anti-Semitic personality or media, as well as and a controversy type of theories, which include the Holocaust denial. Lastly, I want to kind of speak on intersectionality, which plays an important role in a person experiencing oppression. This term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, where she describes the interconnected nature of the social categories, such as race or class, as well as gender, culture, and as they apply to a given person or a group, regarded as creating overlapping independent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So if we take the stick person in the middle here and we say that this person identifies as female, she identifies as being Latinx, as well as lesbian and maybe of a lower class, she would be at an extremely much higher chance of being discriminated against or just being disadvantaged in this country. So lastly, right, we talked about racial trauma, race-based stress, and then also intersectionality. I want to talk about what are some of the consequences or the impact of some of these experiences to a person or a community. So the first one is going to be some hypervigilance to threat, suspiciousness, avoidance, frustration and anger, like one it was mentioned from one of the audience members, flashbacks and nightmares. There can always come along with depression or anxiety, other mental health disorders, medical conditions like heart disease and other ones as well too. And lastly, it can shake like your sense of self. And so that can create self-doubt and also contribute to a poor self-image of oneself. A lot of times when we talk about racial trauma, it is often compared to post-traumatic stress disorder. And so it does. There's some symptoms that you can have from traumatic stress disorder, but racial trauma is so much more unique than post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Um, Racial trauma is solely based on a person's race, and so that says that based on my race, I have a higher chance of experiencing race-based stress, as well as it actually being ongoing and reoccurring. And it also not only affects the individual, but it can affect communities as a whole. So with that being said, it's at a much higher chance of occurring. Therefore, it can have a lot of long-lasting consequences on individuals and communities as a whole.
Afternoon, everyone, and please remember that you can engage here by adding comments, perspectives, and questions in the chat. We will have some time for a little more informal discussion, and so would love to have some of your thinking kind of rolling along there as we move forward. I'm also grateful for the visualization activity, and I have to acknowledge that even though I knew exactly what was coming, my breathing is still labored by the end. Like those physical symptoms, I think maybe I'm just a person who's very prone to storing some of that stress and distress inside of my body. So I thank you all for participating in that. And I want to kind of move this conversation forward regarding the impact of racial trauma on our communities. And I will start by saying that there is a book that's not very new, came out in 2015, but that is also still quite profound, called Unveiling Whiteness in the 21st Century. And it talks about global manifestations and transdisciplinary interventions. This book looks really broadly at a concept that may be new to some of you, but there are quite a few scholars truly researching what is whiteness. And I know that that term could perhaps cause some discomfort. And so I just invite you to lean into this next piece of the presentation, to ask some questions, to check in with yourself, and to plan to take what you can from this concept. What I will tell you is that racism can cause a response similar to a trauma response for people who witness it, right? So it can cause a response that was very well articulated here for people who experience it, but it also can cause a response that's similar to trauma for people who witness it, and particularly for people who witness it and do not respond to it at the time. So I bring this up because there are lots of reasons why a person may not be able or may not choose to respond to racism at a particular time, and also it still could have an impact on the person, a negative impact, an impact that causes them to experience some of the kinds of negative impacts that a person might have if they go through a trauma. In addition, this book really does an interesting job of clarifying that the denial of racism, so denying that racism exists, is an important element of whiteness that requires some examination. It requires some reckoning. A part of getting to a healthy white identity is being able to reckon with the ways that the denial of racism has been taught and affirmed and encouraged in the confines of white identity. And furthermore, it goes on to describe that the denial of racism actually facilitates the continuation of racist attitudes and mores, which can manifest themselves as racist behaviors. So the denial of racism is actually a big barrier to being able to move toward anti-racism work. In addition, I would also share that racial segregation and racial stereotypes limit the opportunities that we have to have healthy relationships across racial groups, right? So just the notion of us being able to work together in healthy work teams, live together in healthy communities, and engage with one another in deep and meaningful friendships is challenged by racial segregation and racial stereotypes. So how do we move forward? Well, one thing that must happen is that we have to have some healing and some reconciliation around whiteness and white identity in order to make space for anti-racism and strong, healthy communities to truly take place. So what does it look like to move toward anti-racism? One thing I would just share is that I started looking for a good image for this slide, and I typed in listen, learn, change, and recognize that, boy, is there a lot out there about this concept right now, and that many movements and many activists, as well as many people working in schools and government and industry, are really kind of taking on this tagline to understand what their work looks like moving forward. Listen, surely you have heard before, is such an important key to moving toward anti-racism. And perhaps it even sounds simple at first. However, I find that as human beings, we're most inclined to listen to those who are most like us. And that limits our learning, that we end up just hearing more and more of what we already know, and we don't have an opportunity to challenge ourselves and to use our own good thinking to be able to figure out problems. So I pose the question to you: how are you seeking opportunities to learn from people who are not like you? What have you read most recently? Has it included anything that you thought you might struggle with? Whose podcast did you listen to that you didn't post on social media because you weren't sure if your networks would approve of it or not? You don't have to share everything, and you can still benefit from spending some time really engaging in somebody else's thinking. In a world that is more and more polarized, it's critical to take time to listen to voices that are different from our own. And when I say that, I'm not only speaking to people who identify as white, who perhaps need to do some additional work listening to people of color. I'm talking to all of us engaging in the specific effort of identifying voices that are different from ours and wrestling with their ideas. It's critical. It requires effort to learn about another perspective and to sincerely consider it. And the practice itself leads us to stronger communities. We're each responsible for our own learning, okay? So listening is not about going to the one person of color that you feel like you can trust in your social circle to ask them all of the questions that you have. That could actually cause harm. That could be alienating, that could be tokenizing. And yet, at our fingertips, we have the internet where, it's fair to say we can find a lot of really awful things there, but we can also find a lot of really powerful resources. The lecture from the next young, bright ... who's sharing something powerful that is necessary to challenge you. The dissertation from the bright scholar who's bringing the new ideas that you need right at this time. So I really challenge you to identify some new learning that you are wrestling with, because what you should be doing, I would say in professional life as well as personal life, but certainly in personal life, is having some things that you engage in because it's joyful and peaceful, and some things that are really sharpening the sword of your own engagement in your community. And that is about wrestling with other people's ideas. It really is human to respond to new and troubling information with denial. I can think of how many times it's been a coping mechanism in tough situations myself. And the book I referenced earlier, Unveiling Whiteness, it discusses that one element of whiteness as it's been structured in our society is that it gives unspoken permission to white people to remain in denial about the existence of racism. This is one of those unspoken values that holds racism in place in institutions and organizations. I think it's important for you to consider what opportunities you can find to listen to new voices and to lean in. It will be work to not push back with denial, to acknowledge that it's there, that inclination, and to lean in to really listen. However, that work of pushing back on denial is truly worth it. And it's a critical part of us being able to understand one another, and also to figure out how we can really help our community understand us and what we bring to the table. So I talked about this denial, and I particularly want to focus on denying that racism exists because it is a common response to do that. So acknowledging that racism exists is actually a critical first step to anti-racism. So you can't be against racism if deep down you're questioning whether it's a real thing. Denial is common. It's one of the ways that we wrestle with a troubling past as a nation. It's one of the ways that we can wrestle with challenges and troubles as human beings. And denial around racism has been structured as a tool to hold racism in place. So acknowledging that racism exists, it may seem easy at first. You may be responding and saying, oh, well, I know there's racism. However, there are really insidious ways that institutions, laws, policies, and structures create space for racism to negatively impact people. So much so that it can become really overwhelming, okay? It's not enough to acknowledge that there are individuals who hold racist ideology. Instead, taking a step toward anti-racism is about acknowledging that institutions and structures that we hold dear have been influenced and shaped by the racism in our society. So you see, I have an image here with some institutions: family, education, religion, economics, government. I see that education one, and education has been my career. Even before that, it's just been my heart. And it is hard for me to think about the ways that our educational systems have been structured and shaped by racism. And yet it is critical for me to do so and for me to understand that as I show up for work every day, as I try to support my family engaging in this system of education. Being able to acknowledge that we participate in systems and structures that have been shaped by racism is really important. Consider for a moment, how have you responded when someone has told you a story about racism? Did you affirm the reality of racism in our society, but rebuff the possibility that it could be happening in your organization? Did you stand up for your institution, even though you buy cognitively that it may have been shaped by racism, because it felt really personal to have someone share something negative about an institution you hold so dear? What does it look like to truly appreciate and consider the perspectives of others in this situation? Have you ever challenged yourself to consider how the values and beliefs that help you understand who you are may be rooted in racism or white supremacy? Are there values of yours that require questioning? Are there ethics and morals that it might be valuable for you to reconsider? Has a friend ever challenged you to do so? If your answer is no, it's important to develop a more broader base of friends, because this is a critical part of us living in a healthy community, is to have people who are so different in these areas in this little Wordle box that there's opportunity for questioning and challenging, and that opportunity actually makes us better individuals and better citizens. So, I think it is important to recognize that a lot of times we can get to the point of the things that I've shared. Racism exists, systems and structures are complicated. I want to do something about it. I will work to educate myself and try to apply that learning in different situations, but I'm overwhelmed. What in the world could little old me do in this gigantic institution that has existed over the course of several hundreds of years? It can make us stuck. We can start to feel like maybe we need to take a break from this topic for a while. And so I really want us to wrap up thinking some about empowerment. And I am really grateful to the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, who actually were doing their Undoing Racism workshops in the Waterloo, Cedar Falls area, probably 10 years ago when I was in that area. I'm grateful to say that they also continue to produce really wonderful content on their website. So if you haven't been to this website, check it out. They have been very engaged in the midst of COVID-19 and the heightened racial tension in the United States, and they have some really powerful resources there, particularly a telling of history that I think anyone, even the highest historical scholar, can learn from. So I encourage you to go there and check out their resources. I love their concept of gatekeeping, and I want to describe it for you a little bit and try to explain why I think it is just the key to how we move forward in creating a more equitable community that really has anti-racism as one of its most powerful values. So I'll read here, I took this directly from their website. Gatekeeping. Persons who work in institutions often function as gatekeepers to ensure that the institution perpetuates itself. By operating with anti-racist values and networking with those who share those values and maintaining accountability in the community, the gatekeeper becomes an agent of institutional transformation. So in any organization, no matter our job title, no matter if we are the lowest employee in the organizational chart or the highest employee in the organizational chart, we play a role in ensuring that an institution perpetuates itself. Whether we are doing small things like communicating who is welcome here and who is not, making decisions about for whom we will go the extra mile and who we won't, whether we produce the signage and the information that helps people find their way in a way that is accessible and engaging to people across communities, or we have a gatekeeping role that is more specific. I take myself, for example, as the Dean of Students as a college. I have this powerful gatekeeping role. I make decisions about who gets to continue with school and who has to go. That is a powerful, powerful gatekeeping role. And one of the things that we know about institutions is that they have been shaped by race and racism that has been a part of our culture for a very long time. And that absent of questioning those values, it is the natural, the default for a gatekeeper to continue to perpetuate that problem. However, once a gatekeeper commits to questioning their system, to wrestling with how do I engage this in a more anti-racist way, to taking opportunities when a person has a seat at the table to step to the side and make space for people whose voices truly need to be heard, there's an opportunity for a gatekeeper to hold open a gate for people in an institution that intended to have that gate closed. So wherever you are in your organization right now, I challenge you to consider your gatekeeping role. So long as you're not thinking about where your power is, you are perpetuating the systems of racism that exist in your organization. It is critical for you to say, what power do I wield here, and how am I going to use it for the purposes of anti-racism for the good of my community? So I challenge you to do that. I challenge you to weigh in on the places where you have voice and therefore an opportunity to welcome other voices. And I really challenge you to consider whether you can afford to take one day off from considering your gatekeeping role and using it to hold that gate open. So as we transition, I just want to say that I know we're talking about heavy stuff. I know this can be a tiring scenario to look at institutions. It can be challenging. And I also want you to know that we have a really important why. Why challenge myself? Why challenge myself to do things differently, to think differently, to engage with people differently? And it is truly about the theme of this conference. Economic inclusion is a powerful notion. And on the conference website, they had that video, which really was asking us to do a visualization activity, to visualize a future where everyone in the Cedar Valley is working and participating in our economy as consumers and as investors. So I ask you, what kind of Cedar Valley could we create if we all had things to contribute and to gain from our participation in economic and the social well-being of our community? And how hard would I be willing to work to get my institution, my organization, my household moving in that direction? As we close today, I just challenge you to consider your role and your power and to make a commitment to take some next steps to creating more opportunities for all. So I thank you. I can see there's lots going on in the chat. I haven't been able to keep up, but I'm hoping that you have, Gwen, and that you might be able to throw out some things that kind of keep this dialogue going.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Shantilla. I definitely have been keeping track of things, and I've also been jotting down some questions. I just wanted to quickly check the time there. One of the questions from the chat, let's start with you, Melissa. How do you assist your BIPOC students and staff at Kirkwood who may be experiencing race-based trauma?
Thank you for the question. Do you know who the question came from? Just since we can't see faces, I'm just trying to relate to the screen.
Okay, I don't know if, well, she's out there, Rhonda McRina, who is at Hawkeye Community College.
Yeah, awesome, thank you. So this has been a challenge for us, particularly as it relates to our new context in COVID. We have been working in two ways, really, I would say, to try to engage this. A part of this has been about building our reputation as a department, as the Dean of Students Office, as a safe place to come to get affirmation and to share concerns. And that starts with relationship building and competence. So there are around 30 people in our department, and we've done things like specifically committed to our institution's KPIs that we will have every individual engage in some sort of training that is about understanding the experience of marginalized populations that they feel they can translate back into their own work. So sort of thinking about how to identify and articulate that gatekeeping role and how some new learning and empathy building can contribute to that. We also have been doing some events and programs and have really been challenged with what it looks like to not have many of our students physically here. Having safe space, physical space where people can hang out and feel like they are not on display has been really critical to us. And also the COVID scenario has changed it. So we are certainly still trying to figure that out.
What about you, Shan? Your situation's a little different because it's your job.
Yeah.
But essentially, can you talk to us about how do you help students who are coming to you with race-based trauma and they may not even know that's what they're suffering from?
Sure. I think that's the most important part, Gwen, is to kind of give it a definition so that they can have something to identify with in regards to it. But here on campus, we do a lot of support. Like we have a student support group, me and Kia Levy from this, for students that's about kind of supporting students through racial trauma, kind of in a healing type of a situation. I think the most important thing is to find like safe spaces where people can just be themselves, be authentic, and be able to talk about their experiences minus judgment, and have confidentiality. So we do a lot of support groups, as well as we do one with you too, Gwen, the staff one. So we have a support group too on campus for staff, and we also, it's a racial healing group. But in like the session, like I said, I think it's important to, first of all, validate those experiences, acknowledge that this is what's happening, and then find ways for them to cope with it. Just like any other therapist, when we have somebody that comes to us with the concern of like chronic stress, because that's how I identify race-based stress. It's chronic, it's ongoing. You can't really you don't know when it's gonna occur next. So what do you do when chronic trauma or stress may happen? You gotta plan for it. So I work with students on definitely giving a name to what's going on, planning for how do I want to respond to this? How do I manage it when it comes? So that's some of the things that I do in session and what we do on campus.
Okay. We'll flip it over and we'll start with you, Shantilla, and then Melissa, you can answer this one. Is there a comprehensive list of podcasts or books that individuals should be taking a look at?
Sure. I'll be happy to go ahead and upload some resources. I think I can do it on the app afterwards, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go ahead and upload some. There are one that comes to my mind that has a lot of resources on her website too, and it's Therapy for Black Girls. A lot of times she connects other people with other like resources and podcasts. That's a really good one for people of color, because she kind of connects you to a lot of different other podcasts. But yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll be happy to upload some resources. And
Awesome. You have anything for us, Melissa?
This is very education specific, but I do feel like I have been very influenced by a book called the Guide for White Women Teaching Black Boys. And as a person who's not a white woman and instead is a Black parent of Black boys, I learned a lot from that book. And I think it's a powerful resource for a lot of people. And it includes some corresponding videos that go along with each chapter of the book. And so it's a really wonderful resource. I'll be sure to make sure Chantel and I had put together some resources beforehand, but I'll be sure to add that to the list as well.
Okay. Next question. Melissa, how do we address racism while consciously not centering whiteness?
Yeah, this is such a powerful point. I I think that one thing to say for people who are white who are really seeking to address racism is that there has to be a conscious decision to create space for the perspectives of people of color. So a lot of times folks don't notice when they're in a space that's a predominantly white space that the person of color hasn't even had a chance to say anything. And so there can be really intentional efforts to say, you know, if I'm gonna pay attention to what I'm saying, then every third time I say something, what I'm gonna say is, I wonder what so to either pose a question about a whole group, I wonder what students of color might think of this perspective, or to specifically find an opportunity to amplify the voice of a person of color by saying, boy, I really agree with Gwen's comment about such and such. Gwen, do you have other thoughts about this? That decision to use a white voice in a space, particularly in a conversation about racism, to amplify the voices of marginalized groups is really critical. It really is, again, an empowerment piece of things. So that would be my very first thing. And I feel like that is the beginning of trying to recognize what some of the other opportunities look like. It takes some effort, and also it's worth it.
Good ones. Chantilla?
I would have to agree with what Melissa said. I think I love the whole idea and premise of gatekeeping, right? Because you don't have to have a certain status in order to like utilize that skill. We were talking about this earlier. Like you can be, like maybe you were the janitor in the hallway, but by that janitor smiling at me and saying, "Good morning, Chantella. Nice to see you," that can change the perspective of how I feel about the place that I work at. So I think it's just important to have good, safe places for people of color to be able to express themselves, get their experiences validated, as well as just kind of utilizing that, the empowerment of being a good gatekeeper.
I want to let both of you know that you are getting a lot of affirmation in the chats. I have a few questions for you if you don't mind. How does racial trauma show up in the workplace? And how could a supervisor or a colleague help someone?
Sure, I'll go ahead. Okay. One of the ways that I look at it is through like fatigue, almost in a way. Let's say you have a person of color that's an employee who works with the public. Even take like what's going on recently in the world, all those experiences. So they're coming into work and they're navigating what we would call like white spaces because maybe they're like a few of only them that kind of look like them, or they're the only person that is a person of color. So they're going into work and they get a little fatigued. Like you start to experience fatigue from all the race-based stress or the secondary or vicarious trauma that you're seeing going on around you. So it may show up in just exhaustion, avoiding other people. Maybe they're calling in, because they need time to themselves to kind of replenish themselves or fill back up their cup. Maybe they are feeling isolated. It's just so many ways that it can show up in the workplace. But I think the best way to approach it is coming from like maybe a one-on-one conversation on the best way to support them and to check in to see if that is what is occurring with them at the time. Because you really don't want to assume you know what somebody is going through. you want to check in with them and say, hey, this is what I observe in your behaviors, or, this is what I see what's going on. How can I support you? What would that look like, type of a situation?
Okay. Thank- Melissa, before you respond, I just want to share that that is exactly what I have been witnessing with people of color this semester. Just that fatigue, that sense of being overwhelmed. I know that because they have said as much when I've reached out to check on certain people. And there's just this, like they're carrying this heavy load all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, Melissa, did you have any thoughts before we have to end?
I would just add that there are a lot of things that supervisors can do to support employees who are people of color. And it starts with just acknowledging that they carry a different load. They likely carry a different load for the organization than their white colleagues. For instance, they might be that support person for the other people of color who work at the institution. And that may be invisible to the white supervisor. However, it still exists, right? And that is an important role that people may choose to play. And also, it's important to acknowledge that there's an additional load that is being carried. I also know that the expression of emotion in different places is very highly policed, right? So if the expectation in the workplace is that there are a lot of unspoken rules about it, right? So anger, distress, frustration, yes, it can be expressed in tears, but only if you're this type of person and only in this context. Otherwise, you might be too female or too angry or on and on there. So expression of emotion in the workplace is policed, which is very problematic. And so if you truly want to support your employees, then I pose a question like, is there a safe space for a person to express some emotion in your physical workspace? And if your answer is the bathroom, it's problematic, and there's a need to really wrestle with how do you give people space? So we don't really need to be diagnosed with experiencing racial trauma. We need there to be systems built that create space for us to have healthy opportunities to go about what sometimes can be toiling away at a really heavy load.
Yeah. Well, thank you to both of you, and thank you to everyone who has attended. They are uploading resources in the app, right?
Yes.
Okay, I think that takes care of us. I'm so glad you were here with us today for the conference. Really appreciate everyone who took the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.